Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.TV. Most of us know about D-Day, the dramatic launch of the Allied invasion of Europe in June 1944. But history has largely overlooked the important and fascinating role played by African American soldiers who were part of that heroic invasion. Until now, that is. My guest is Linda Hervieux, author of a wonderful new book titled Forgotten: The Untold Story of D-Day's Black Heroes at Home and at War. Linda, how are you? Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for inviting me.
So as you point out, this is a story that's been largely lost to history. So take us back in time. It focuses largely on something called the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion. What in the world was that?
Right. Well, it's interesting because the 320th was one of 4 African American battalions that the Army formed out of some 30 barrage balloon units. And this is a largely forgotten section of the American Army in World War II. Barrage balloons were created with the idea coming from Britain to have an aerial minefield, so to have a curtain of balloons flying in a sawtooth pattern over a defensive site.
There were no troops in these balloons.
No, they were flown from the ground, and they were essentially flown with a steel piano cable. And the first ones were huge. They were the size of 3 school buses. And the men flew them from the ground in crews of 5 to 12, depending on the size of the balloon. And the idea was that if an enemy plane came and snagged the cable, it would stall and it would crash. The balloons that went to war with the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion were smaller. They were about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. They could be flown by 3 or 4 men, and they could actually land with the soldiers on the beaches. So this African American battalion, because the U.S. Army was segregated like much of America, this unit of African American soldiers landed in Normandy for D-Day.
So the 320th were all black soldiers?
Yes, they were black soldiers with white commanders.
How did you first hear about these soldiers?
In June of 2009, it was the 65th anniversary of D-Day, and the French government was planning a big celebration.
We should point out you live in France.
Yeah, I'm an American journalist, but I live in France. And the French government was looking for an interesting American to honor with the Legion of Honor, which is their highest honor. And they found William Dabney. He is a veteran of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion from Roanoke, Virginia. And William Dabney went to Paris to receive the Legion of Honor at Invalides, which is the shrine to all things military in France. And at this ceremony on June 5th in 2009, he was given this award. He shook the hand of Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg. And he was not aware at the time who they were, but he was aware that Saving Private Ryan did not show any African Americans on the beach, as every African American vet I talked to said.
So he was aware of the movie.
He was aware of the movie,
Yeah.
and later his son said, "Well, do you know who that was? He was in Saving Private Ryan," and he was just so shell-shocked to be the center of attention. He's the baby of the battalion. He was 89 then.
Wow.
And he was not drafted. He signed up. He wanted to join. He was 17. His grandmother had to sign his papers. He wanted to be with his friends. He wanted to go to war. And he's a very humble man. And the fact that he was the one featured was quite a story for the American journalists there. We all wrote about him.
So your book is as much a chronicle of the life of African Americans in the United States during the Jim Crow era as it is about these soldiers. So we're talking about the period, first half of the 1940s, essentially.
Right.
So talk about what life was like for blacks here then.
Well, one of the interesting things for me was learning the history of my own country that I wasn't aware of. I wasn't aware that the U.S. Army was segregated. I did, of course, know the South was segregated, but I didn't realize the extent of this. I didn't realize what Jim Crow laws actually meant. And for these men, and they came from all over the U.S., but a large number of them from the states ringing Washington, D.C., most of them from the South. For them, life varied from southern sharecropping Virginia, where the standard of living was slightly better than the days of slavery, to Bill Dabney had a more privileged existence in Roanoke. He lived with his grandmother. He went to a good school. He left his junior year of high school. To Atlantic City, New Jersey is another subject of the book. I started in Atlantic City, which for me was quite interesting to learn that even in New Jersey, there was effectively de facto Jim Crow.
Right. It was essentially segregated.
It was essentially segregated, not by law, but by practice. And there was a very distinct neighborhood called the North Side, where the African Americans of Atlantic City, whose descendants built Atlantic City in the mid-1800s into America's first planned premier resort. And for these men and women of Atlantic City, life was pretty good. They thought they had a very vibrant community. They also had jobs, you know, for the 3 months that Atlantic City was open for business.
These were mostly menial jobs, though, right? They weren't great jobs.
They were menial jobs, and you had to have many of them. You couldn't just have one. So Wilson Monk, who leads the book, was everything from a waiter at white tablecloth restaurants where he could not eat, to selling saltwater taffy, to delivering prescriptions for a drugstore. You know, but there were jobs, and that was unusual because a lot of the Southern migrants who came to fill these jobs were happy to have them. So while they weren't the best jobs, they were there and they were available, and that was something in 1941.
So you've mentioned two of the soldiers that you focused on. Wilson Monk is one, William Dabney is the other. Who was the third?
Well, there was also Waverly Woodson, and Waverly Woodson was a medic. He was a pre-med student. He went on to train as a medic. And he's from West Philadelphia. And then there's Henry Parham, and he's the one from sharecropping country in Virginia. And those are the men that the book focuses on. But there's a lot of other men who come in. I was able to find 12 men still living who could tell me their story.
How'd you track them down?
Well, that was difficult. After I met Bill Dabney, they told us he was the last one still alive. But nobody really checked, and I was looking for a roster of men from the unit, and that doesn't exist in Army archives. So, you know, newspaper reporters always go where the money is. So we found payroll records from 1943 at an archive in St. Louis. And from those payroll records, one of my ex-colleagues at the New York Daily News helped me track these guys down. And it took a while. But eventually, over the years, we got 12, and the families of many others, too, who were very happy to talk about their fathers, although some of them didn't even know their dads were at D-Day, because the men never talked about this for the most part.
Wow. So these fellows end up in the Army. Some were drafted, some enlisted. Mm-hmm. It's wartime, World War II. What was life like for them in this segregated army?
Well, it was, for the men from the South, it was business as usual.
They were used to it.
It was the life they knew, and I'll tell you more about what that was like when I tell you that for the Northern soldiers, this was a shock. Even Wilson Monk in Atlantic City, who was not welcome in restaurants, was stunned when he was on the train going to his training camp, and somewhere around Washington, D.C., he's told that he has to move to the Negro car, and he wants to know, what's the Negro car? Well, that's where, and he'd never heard of it, and that's where all of the African Americans had to sit, and it was always hard by the filthy coal engine. Right. So you could be quite nicely dressed, you had your army khakis on, and you would just be covered in coal dust by the time you reached your destination. And that destination for these men was Tennessee, northwestern Tennessee. Camp Tyson was a camp built particularly for the training of men to fly barrage balloons, these new defensive weapons. And it was near this little town called Paris, which was named after Paris, France. And these men were not welcome in Paris, Tennessee.
Right.
So that was a brutal introduction for them to segregation. Their army camps were like the community. Everything was two. It was a huge expense for the army to do this. There were separate mess halls, separate barracks, separate bathrooms. Everything was double in the army, and it was just an incredibly inefficient way to run an army in wartime.
One of the points that repeatedly comes up is that these African American soldiers, especially in the South, would see German prisoners of war treated very differently than the black soldiers themselves. Talk about that a little bit. This
was one of the biggest shocks to me, learning that there were even German prisoners of war in America. And in fact, there were 425,000 of them interned mostly in camps in the South, in the Southwest, and the Midwest. A lot of them were brought there because they could work on farms that were owned by German American immigrants.
The prisoners could.
Yeah, because they had jobs and they were paid according to the Geneva Convention. They were allowed to eat in restaurants at transit points and train stations as they were being brought around the country, but black soldiers in uniform could not. So the stories are rampant, and all of these men, to a man, had stories about this, and they remembered it as vividly as anything, about seeing lines of German prisoners marching into restaurants, about sharing cigarettes with the white American soldiers guarding them, backslapping treatment, where the African Americans were told to go around the back to get a sandwich. They were relegated to really dumpy restaurants around these train stations, or they weren't allowed to take a break and take a nap on a bench.
Right.
And they all, to a man, remembered stories like this, and it was very shocking to me. And then when I researched German prisoners of war and found there were so many, and even Camp Tyson, after the barrage balloon battalions were dispersed from there, they were sent to Europe and elsewhere. Camp Tyson became an internment camp for German prisoners as well, and Italian prisoners too.
So these soldiers in the 320th, the African American unit, they are packed up and sent off to Europe. They're destined to land at Normandy on D-Day, but before that, they go to Great Britain.
Right.
Talk about their experience in Britain.
Well, these men had no idea where they were going when they left Camp Tyson, and they had a train ride up to New York with the curtains drawn on the train because Southern whites were known to shoot at train cars with black soldiers aboard. They arrive in Camp Shanks, which is about 25 minutes outside of the city. They take a converted Cunard liner to Britain, packed with American soldiers. There's 8,000 troops aboard this ship. They zigzag across the North Atlantic, terrified of that perhaps a German sub would sink them. And then they don't know where they're arriving, and they land in Scotland. And Wilson Monk from Atlantic City says it was the most beautiful sight ever. Wow. Seeing emerging from, because they were in the bottom of the ship the whole time. And then they emerge, and suddenly, right away, they realize things are different. They can use any bathroom they want. They get on a train car. There's some white people in the train cars as they go south. And they spend time in the villages of Oxfordshire and Wales. And in these villages, they realize for the first time, we're just being treated like anybody. You know, we're being treated as Americans. And everybody kept saying, oh, you Americans, you know, and they had never really thought of themselves first as Americans. They thought of themselves as black men. And
expected to be treated differently.
Expected to be treated differently, expected segregation. Both the black and white troops aboard these ships heading to Britain expected segregation. They just thought it was a natural state. They couldn't believe that it didn't exist.
And you wrote that a lot of the white soldiers resented the fact that black soldiers were just treated normally.
Very much. And for the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, when they were in Wales, they were among the first black soldiers to be there. So they weren't hassled at first. And that was very unique because the British government was quite worried before the black soldiers arrived that they would be set upon by the white Americans, who would be resentful that they were welcomed and they were treated equally. They were invited into people's homes. They could dance with girls. They could go to any pub they wanted. And this was a cause of concern among the British government, because they didn't want the importation of American Jim Crow. They didn't want lynching. They were very worried that there was going to be lynching in Britain because of the presence of so many Americans.
I knew that they didn't have official segregation or legal segregation in Great Britain, but I was surprised reading in your book at how seemingly welcoming the Brits were, and in many cases they became true friends of these African American soldiers. Were you surprised by that?
I was surprised, but I had no idea that there were so many African Americans in Britain. There were 130,000 black soldiers in the course of 2 years that passed through Britain. A lot of the people in these towns had never seen a person of color, and their reaction was not to pull away. Their reaction was to say, "Well, come to our homes." And in the case of Wilson Monk from Atlantic City, he was taken in by a Welsh family. He spent every Sunday with them at church and then at their home. A correspondence between that Welsh woman and his mother in Atlantic City is very emotional, and those letters remain today. I quote from them in the book. And it was quite something. I mean, he had never been friends with a white person. Didn't know it was possible.
So this sojourn in Great Britain has to end. They go off to Normandy. For these soldiers, what was the landing like?
The landing was a brutal landing. It was you see the footage from D-Day movies of the landing. That was their landing. The first, as far as I can tell, the first African Americans on the beach were the medics, the 5 medics from the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion. The battalion was scattered with the infantry in 150 landing craft headed toward Omaha and Utah beaches. They landed under heavy fire. They were supposed to be landing later when the artillery fire was cleared, because you can't raise a balloon with artillery fire like that. And but they landed in the heat of it, because nothing went according to schedule on D-Day. It was chaos. Everybody landed off miles away from where they were supposed to land because of problems with the current and just the general smokescreen that covered the beach and the sea. And a lot of them had no idea where they were coming in. They couldn't see landmarks. So these men were just infantry troops. They were combat troops as they landed and dug foxholes and rounded up German prisoners and did what other combat troops did on that morning.
This landing in general was heroic. History has covered it intensely. But one of these black soldiers that you wrote about, I believe it was Waverly Woodson,
right,
was exceptionally heroic himself, right?
He was exceptionally heroic. Waverly Woodson was a pre-med student at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. He signed up as soon as he could to be in the Army. He trained as an officer. Officer training was one of the few bastions of the Army that was integrated, and the reason was the U.S. Army didn't think that black men were smart enough to pass the test to be officers, so they didn't bother to set up segregated schools for them. So Waverly Woodson gets in. Waverly Woodson is told that there aren't officer spots available. And that was also a very common story for black soldiers. So he gets medical training and he becomes a medic. He's with the 320th. He's in a landing ship tank, which is one of the bigger landing crafts, with tanks and about 55 other infantrymen. And they land, and before he even hits the beach, he's hit by shrapnel. And he's badly wounded, and he comes on the beach, after a tank that is just blown off the beach. All of the men are killed. And he finds a tent roll in the water because their equipment is largely lost. And he sets up a medical station in the cover of the shingle, which is a sort of embankment of stones that provided temporary cover from the German guns.
He's doing this while he's wounded himself.
Yeah, he has wounds that he's patched up very quickly by another medic, and they go and they just start pulling drowning men out of the water. They start patching them up. He amputates a foot. He's pulling out bullets. He's doing everything that you would imagine one does when you have carnage all around. He's haunted by the cries of, "Doc, Doc, help me," and he can't get to everyone. And Waverly Woodson works for 30 hours. And this isn't just speculation or exaggeration. This is according to the Army's own press release of him at the moment.
An army that was not anxious to make heroes out of black soldiers.
No, but they were becoming aware of the fact that because of the efforts of groups like the NAACP and other pressure groups, and the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, they had to give black soldiers their due. And so Waverly Woodson was picked as a man who was extraordinarily heroic on D-Day. He worked for 30 hours and then he collapsed from his wounds.
Wow.
And he was taken to a medical ship, 3 days later asked to go back to the beach. And, you know, while the infantry was all trying to get off the beach, the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion was staying on the beaches, and they were in France for 140 days.
Now, he had died, right? You didn't meet him.
No, unfortunately, I did not, but he was celebrated at the time, so there's quite a trail of Waverly Woodson's heroics. And then for the 50th anniversary of D-Day, he did, in 94, he did a lot of interviews. So we have his words and we have his record. What we didn't know is that he was nominated for the Medal of Honor. And there is one paper at the Truman Library that shows that he was a candidate for the Medal of Honor. Why he didn't get it, we don't know, but no African American soldiers did until Bill Clinton awarded 7 of them in 1997.
Now, what's your background and why did you want to write this book?
Well, after I interviewed Bill Dabney, I was fascinated with his story, and I wanted to know more about Bill. And then when they told us there was no one else still alive, and I asked, well, how do you know? It just was the simple fact that nobody checked. They just assumed these men are aging, there's probably no one left. Right. And I just saw that as unfortunate because we don't know his story. And after those few newspaper stories written about Bill Dabney, we wouldn't know about these men anymore. And it just seemed a shame not to get these stories in the few years we had left because almost everybody is gone.
You have a journalism background yourself.
Yeah, I've been a newspaper reporter since I was 17, and I worked at the Daily News here in New York.
About that Daily News connection, my old paper.
Yeah, yeah, and I wrote the story for Bill Dabney for the Daily News.
Right.
And it was because of that I just started looking. I was also incredibly angry that I didn't know the own history of my country. I didn't know how bad things were during that time, and how come I didn't learn that? Why isn't this in our textbooks? Why isn't this part of our curriculum, that how horrific Jim Crow really was?
Do you know how many members of the 320th are still alive?
I was only able to find 12. I'm sure there's more. The problem is, you know, looking at 1943 payroll records, if those men do not still live where they were, and if they have common names, it's very hard to find them. So we did everything we could to find them. I'm sure there are more alive. I know there are men alive that can't speak. They're incapacitated.
Right.
They're in nursing homes. One man who's in the book who's flying a barrage balloon through a field in France. In Louisiana, he's still with us, Arco Shaw, but he's in a nursing home. I would love to hear from more families of these men. I would love, every man I found has a page on my website with photos and their bios as much as I could get, and I would love to put more on, so.
Well, it's a marvelous book. I'm really glad you came by to talk to us about it. It's called Forgotten, The Untold Story of D-Day's Black Heroes at Home and at War. Linda Hervieux, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
We'll be back in a moment with a final word. 3 recent murders in New York. In one, an aide to Governor Andrew Cuomo was shot in the head when he got caught in the crossfire of a gunfight between 2 gangs in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. In the second, a 12-year-old girl was about to sit down to dinner with her brother at their home in Long Island when she was hit by a bullet that came blasting through the living room window. Police said someone else who lived in the building was a target of the shooter. In the third murder, a New York City police officer was shot and killed on a pedestrian bridge over the FDR highway by, according to authorities, a gunman with a long criminal record. There is a passionate and growing movement in this country against excessive violence and indefensible killings by police officers. It's an important issue and a movement that I support. But I would also support an equally passionate movement against the culture of extreme violence by civilians that has taken so many lives and soaked so many of our communities in blood. These would not be contradictory campaigns. One would not obviate the other. We need both. That's all for now. See you next time.